Good morning to everyone joining us from the US, and good evening if you're joining us from Hong Kong and elsewhere in Asia. Thank you for joining us for today's briefing on Hong Kong. My name is Timi Adeyemi, Program Coordinator for the US Asia Institute, a non-partisan United Nations affiliated nonprofit with a 41-year track record of building understanding between the peoples and governments of the United States and countries of Asia. To begin today's event, I would like to mention just a couple of housekeeping notes. Towards the end of today's briefing, there will be time for our speakers to address your questions. If you have a question, please type it in the chat window at any time or directly message me, and they will be addressed by our speakers after their presentations. You can also find the program for today's event in the chat function. Today's webinar will explore recent developments in Hong Kong, the impact of COVID-19, the ongoing Hong Kong protests, Hong Kong-China-US relations, and Hong Kong's political future. We are pleased to have four tech experts with us today in their different rights. Thank you, Madam Emily Lau, Professor Albert Chen, Mr. Bernard Chan, and Alejandro Reyes for staying late at night to speak to us on a very important topic. We would also like to give a special thanks to CRUSEF, the China-United States Exchange Foundation, and the US Asia Institute's corporate stakeholders for their support: Las Vegas Sands, Fairfield Maxwell, Merck, ConocoPhillips, AIG, and Airbnb. The briefing will be moderated by Alejandro Reyes. Mr. Reyes is the current Director of Knowledge Dissemination and a visiting Associate Professor at Asia Global Institute of the University of Hong Kong. Prior to joining the Institute, he served as Senior Policy Advisor to the Assistant Deputy Minister for Asia Pacific and convener of the Asia Pacific Policy Hub at Global Affairs Canada. A Hong Kong-based independent consultant from 2001 to 2017. He worked with several foundation and international organizations, including the G20 Business Summit, the Clinton Global Initiative, the World Economic Forum, and the US Asia Institute, as well as some corporate clients. He began his professional career as a journalist with Asia Week magazine in Hong Kong and Singapore from 1988 to 2001, and has also edited and written several books. To read Mr. Reyes' full bio, please see the attached program in the chat window. We are very fortunate to have him with us today along with the other three speakers. I will let you take it from here, Al. Thank you.
Morning to you folks in the United States. Good evening to everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Hong Kong protests and COVID-19, the future of Hong Kong's autonomy. My name is Alejandro Reyes. I am Director of Knowledge Dissemination and Associate Professor at the Asia Global Institute of the University of Hong Kong. It's an honor and pleasure to serve as moderator of this discussion. Thank you very much to the US Asia Institute, to Temi, to Mary Sue Bissell, and their colleagues for organizing this event. And of course, the US Asia Institute is a remarkable institution that for 41 years has been building understanding between the US and Asia, particularly between the US and China. This work is all the more essential and valuable today than it has ever been. I'd like to take a moment to remember and pay tribute to one of the founders of the Institute, Esther Key, who with Joji Konoshima had the vision to establish the Institute in 1979. Mrs. Key, who was a formidable guiding force for the Institute, passed away just over a year ago. She and her husband, Norman Lau Key, who died in 2017, were great friends and supporters of Hong Kong, tireless advocates of people-to-people exchange to build better understanding. Now, let me share just a few thoughts about Hong Kong and for our discussion. I returned to Hong Kong in May last year after 2 years working in the Canadian government. I was just in time to witness the series of protests that roiled the city through the remainder of the year. These started as action against an extradition law amendment bill that the government was pushing through the legislature, which many perceived as undermining Hong Kong's autonomy, undermining the one country, two systems principle. It morphed into a broader protest against mainland China, against mainlanders to some extent, against what some see as threats to the way of life in Hong Kong and to Hong Kong's values. Now, I'm holding up here, I don't know if you see it, maybe I should just, this is a mask. This is in fact, a must-wear accessory of the times. an item that has generated much debate around the world, given the pandemic. This face mask in particular is one of the face masks that the Hong Kong government has issued to every resident of Hong Kong. The face mask might well be the ultimate symbol of Hong Kong today. First, it was used by protesters to conceal their identities. And if you were wearing something more elaborate than the one I held up, then you were probably trying to defend against tear gas launched by the police. Then the mask became a symbol of protection and community unity, as the memory of the SARS outbreak from 17 years ago kicked in for many of residents in Hong Kong, and most people took to wearing the masks to protect themselves from infection by the novel coronavirus. Indeed, the government never had to impose a comprehensive mask requirement on the population until just today, because of a worrying third wave of COVID-19 cases that we're having to deal with. In fact, these are the latest numbers. We had 118 new cases reported today, 113 of them local transmissions, 46 of them worryingly from unknown origin. This has brought the total number of cases in Hong Kong to over 3,000, with one death reported today, bringing us to a total of 24 fatalities so far. This was the 8th straight day of triple-digit increases in cases. We are testing more, but clearly Hong Kong is in the worst point since the pandemic crisis began. Our public gathering limit is now down to just 2, and residents cannot serve dine-in customers, gyms, sports facilities, cinemas, schools are closed, and civil servants are working from home, and many others, of course. In Hong Kong U, we're now at work at home protocol as well. All this has been happening even as we are coming to grips with the rapid enactment and implementation of the national security law by China, apparently to prevent a repeat of last year's protests. This has raised questions about how the exercise of freedoms in Hong Kong will be affected. Would Hong Kong people now have to wear figurative masks, gags, if you will, and hold themselves back, not just from going onto the streets, but from expressing their views about China, about the Communist Party of China, about Hong Kong's future and its autonomy? So we've gone from masks for protest to masks for protection, and now possibly, this is a question we'll want to discuss today, masks of proscription, of self-censorship, of possibly curtailed freedoms. So there are many questions. How will the national security law be implemented? What is the impact of the protests and the pandemic on Hong Kong? What has been the impact? How has Hong Kong managed the coronavirus? What directions are the protests going to go now? And what of the pandemic and Hong Kong's handling of the pandemic, particularly with this third wave? And what can we expect in the run-up to the Legislative Council elections in the autumn, scheduled at the moment for September 6th, but possibly to be postponed? And how will the law, the national security law, and Hong Kong more broadly affect US-China relations, as it already has? But this is the overarching question of the day. What does all this mean? What the protests, the proscriptions in a time of pandemic, what does this all mean for the future of Hong Kong, the quality of its autonomy, and its important regional and global roles as an international financial center, as a hub for business, for trade, for investment and culture and the arts, as a seat of higher education, teaching, learning, and research, and as an important interlocutor between China and the West. So as Temi said, we are fortunate to have 3 key Hong Kong figures joining this discussion. They're all very well known. Let me first introduce Emily Lau. I hope she's connected. Emily, are you there? Emily Lau was a member of the Legislative Council from 1991 to 97 and from 98 to 2016. She was the first woman ever elected to LegCo. She served as chairperson of the Democratic Party from 2012 to 2016, and she has received many awards for her work defending human rights and the freedom of speech. Prior to politics, Emily had a distinguished career as a journalist, notably as Hong Kong correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review. I would just like to speak personally and mention that it was a big thrill for me when I was just starting out as a journalist to be Asia Week's Hong Kong correspondent and have the chance to learn the craft by watching the legendary Emily Lau at work, literally rubbing elbows with her. Now let me welcome my Hong Kong U colleague, Professor Albert Chen Hung Yi. He is the Cheng Chan Lan Yu Professor in Constitutional Law in the Department of Law at the University of Hong Kong. He practiced law as a solicitor and has been teaching since 1984, serving as head of the Department of Law from 1993 to 96, and Dean of the Faculty of Law from 96 to 2002. He is a member of the Committee for the Basic Law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region under the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China. He holds several honorary professorships in universities in China. Finally, Bernard Chan was a non-official member of the Executive Council, the Chief Executive's Cabinet, from 2004 to 2009, and from 2012 till now. He is the non-official convener of the Executive Council of Hong Kong, a position he has held since 2017. He is also a deputy to the National People's Congress, China's legislature, and was a member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council between 1998 and 2008. He is a well-known business leader, the president of Asia Financial Holdings and Asia Insurance, the chairman of the Hong Kong-Thailand Business Council, and an advisor to Bangkok Bank Limited in China. He also serves in a number of public service roles, including chairman of the Hong Kong Palace Museum and chairperson of the Hong Kong Council of Social Service. So welcome to our panelists. Now let's dive in. I would like to make this session as conversational as possible and include a good amount of time for questions. We'll try to do 2 rounds with our speakers to start. I would ask our panelists to speak first to the national security law and what to make of it. Then we'll engage in a brief discussion about other issues that I brought up, and then take as many of the audience's questions as time allows. So please do send us questions via the platform as we go along. So Albert, Professor Chen, may I ask you to outline for us your views on the national security law and some of the articles or sections of it that have been cause for concern, the key legal aspects. Thank you.
Thank you. National security law was enacted recently by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. And there are 2 factors which we need to bear in mind in order to understand why it was enacted. So the first factor is that there is in the Hong Kong Basic Law a provision which requires Hong Kong to enact some kind of national security law. This is the famous Article 23 of the Hong Kong Basic Law, which says that Hong Kong should on its own enact laws to prohibit various crimes such as treason, secession, subversion, sedition, and then theft of state secrets and several other matters. So, so that's one factor to bear in mind. Hong Kong should enact national security law under Article 23 of the Basic Law, but it has not done so for 23 years after the handover. So from 1997 until this year, the Hong Kong legislature has not enacted the law which Article 23 requires it to enact. There was an attempt to enact such a law in 2003, but the legislative exercise was shelved indefinitely after a demonstration of an estimated 500,000 people on 1st of July 2003. So that's one factor. The other factor is this anti-extradition bill movement last year. So because of this movement, there were calls for making laws which would, increase the protection of national security and to prevent any recurrence of the riots of last year, which were considered to be very serious. And the Chinese government also considered that foreign forces were at work in promoting or supporting the riots. So the riots were considered by the Chinese government to have revealed a loophole, an important loophole in Hong Kong's law, which is the lack of law to protect national security. And this new national security law is designed to plug this loophole. And the reason why it was introduced now and not at any point in time in the last 23 years was that until the anti-extradition movement of last year, there was no perceived need or urgency to plug this loophole in Hong Kong law. But now it was perceived that it is an urgent matter, and it is also believed that the Hong Kong government does not have the capacity to promote and to get any Article 23 law past the legislature if it were to take on this task itself. That's why the Beijing authorities decided to do it. So that's the background. As for the actual content of the law, is mainly a kind of criminal law dealing with 4 kinds of criminal offenses. One relates to secession, or so-called splitting up the country. The other relates to subversion, which means overthrowing the government, in particular the central government in Beijing, but also there are provisions to protect the SAR government in Hong Kong. Thirdly, it deals with terrorism offenses. And this part of the law is actually quite similar to anti-terrorism laws in other jurisdictions. And it builds upon Hong Kong's existing anti-terrorism law. And fourthly, there's the subject of so-called collusion with foreign forces to endanger national security. So that there is a list of offenses concerning circumstances in which there is collusion between people in Hong Kong and foreign states or foreign countries to perform certain acts which are listed in the law, which are considered to endanger national security. Now, as for the enforcement of the law, the national security law also sets up some institutions, some machinery to ensure that it will be effectively enforced. And one of the most well-known institutions recently set up was the Office of the Central Government for the Safeguarding of National Security in Hong Kong. So this office is the fourth institution set up by the central government in Hong Kong since 1997. And the other 3 are the Chinese military in Hong Kong, the Office of the Commissioner for Foreign Affairs in Hong Kong, and the Liaison Office of the Central Government in Hong Kong. So now we have 4 organs representing the central government in Hong Kong. So basically, that's the background. And I think the 2 key points we should note about this national security law. First is that it overlaps with, but does not coincide with, the subject matters dealt with in Article 23 of the Basic Law. Subversion and succession. These 2 matters are originally in Article 23, and now they are covered by this law. So presumably Hong Kong does not need to enact new laws on these 2 subject matters in the future, but it still have to enact laws on other matters covered by Article 23. Secondly, we should note that the office, the central government's office for safeguarding national security in Hong Kong is given some important powers, which it will only exercise in three kinds of special or extraordinary situations. So apart from these three kinds of situations, cases arising from the national security law will be investigated, prosecuted, and tried by the Hong Kong authorities, including Hong Kong's Department of Justice, which is responsible for prosecution, and the Hong Kong courts. And the appeals go all the way to the Court of Final Appeal, but no further appeal to mainland. So that's basically a brief summary of the law and its background.
Now, Albert, if I could just follow up, of course, there's some provisions that have caused concern, particularly with regards to, first of all, whether people can continue to, who wish to go to the streets to protest, say the things that they were saying last year, in terms of even the media, the flow of information, that the net effect of the law will be to minimize dissent, control dissent, and limit freedoms at the end. I'm wondering if you could address that, because you've talked about a new social contract with Beijing that will allow one country, two systems principle to continue and be implemented. I'm wondering if you could address this particular issue.
Well, the Beijing officials in charge of this law have stressed that this law is designed to set a kind of red line for the one country principle, which is one important component of one country, two systems. So now that the red line has been set as to how to protect the one country principle, there is still room for the further development of one country, two systems. So the Hong Kong system, which is still quite different from the mainland system, can continue to flourish, provided that people don't cross this red line set by the new national security law. So what we need to understand is what actually is the red line, what acts are prohibited by the law, and there are some provisions which mean that certain kinds of speech which were permissible under the previous laws of Hong Kong may now be prohibited by this new national security law, particularly advocacy of Hong Kong independence. I think that is the main target of this law. But to some extent, speech relating to overthrowing or changing fundamentally the political system in mainland China may also be subject to some limits. But we should note that this provision, which is in the subversion offense in the law, is only targeted at acts involving violence or threat of violence or other illegal acts for the purpose of overthrowing or changing the mainland system. So if there's any speech which does not involve advocacy of violence or advocacy of illegal actions for the purpose of overthrowing the mainland political system, that would still be permissible under Hong Kong law.
But may I just, before we move on to next speaker, just follow up on this. There are those who argue that the whole idea is for this law to be ambiguous, for the red line to be not so clear. And in that way, people are self-censoring or will hold back and will consider whether any action that they might take, whether it might be something innocuous as, say, having a Zoom webinar on this particular topic, that could be something that they shouldn't be doing.
Well, personally, I don't think that the provisions of the law are so vague or ambiguous. For example, when we talk about subversion, as I already said, one necessary element of the offense of subversion which, as I already explained, involves trying to overthrow the government in Beijing or the government in Hong Kong, is that there must be violence, threat of violence, or an illegal act. So I think the illegal act element is quite important. An act must be illegal, one have to advocate an illegal act before one can be charged with subversion. So this illegal act is an element of the offense. Of course, it is only one of several elements which must coexist in order for the offense to be proven.
All right. Now, may I turn to Emily? Emily, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. Sorry you cannot see me. I don't know what's wrong with Zoom.
Oh,
No,
right.
yeah, she has to press. She has to press one of the buttons on the screen before we can see her.
Oh, well she's on the phone. So Emily, may I turn to you? May I welcome to belatedly welcome to our webinar. May I turn to you for your thoughts on where we are now, given the introduction of the national security law, and your thoughts on the law in particular?
Well, I think I'm speaking from a very anxious and very frightened Hong Kong. And I do not share the views expressed by Professor Chen. And many people think that this law is very ambiguous, very sweeping, and actually there is no definition of what is national security. And to give you a real-life example, I have an online program this afternoon, and I interview Professor Chen Kin-man, one of the Occupy trio, who actually went to prison for almost a year for this, peacefully occupying the Admiralty area. And he said he was interviewed by a magazine, Breakthrough, and it was a very long interview. And then a few days ago or whatever, he was told that the whole publication would not come out because the church is very, very frightened. And if you know Professor Chan, he never advocated independence or anything like that, or violence. And so people, the church, other publishers, journalists, and many people have been intimidated into committing self-censorship. And some journalists have privately said that maybe they will not and they cannot interview Chris Patton, who's the last governor. Maybe that is not true, but people are so frightened. So that is the Hong Kong we are facing. And this law, and also under what circumstances the national security people will assume jurisdiction here. They are here in Hong Kong already. They don't need to follow Hong Kong laws. They can come into my room now and take me away, or maybe take me back to mainland China for trial. Come on, Professor Chan. We are not protected by Hong Kong's legal system. The Chinese government, the national security, they are here already. Where is one country, two systems? So I think the situation is very, very grave. And as you speak, I'm sure you have heard of the news that the Hong Kong government is thinking, or even the Executive Council has met to discuss whether they should postpone the Legislative Council election, which is going to happen, should happen, on the 6th of September. And over 100 candidates have already registered. They want to stand. And Carrie Lam, the chief executive, and her executive council want to say that because of the pandemic, we have no condition for holding this election. And then they want to go to Beijing, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, ask them to make a decision or to make an interpretation of the basic law to allow this to happen. And so, I mean, we are very, very worried. I'm sure those of you who are from Hong Kong, and I think the speaker after me is Mr. Bernard Chan, and he is the convener of the Executive Council. and he can tell us why. Why do we have to resort to thinking of postponing the Legislative Council election for 1 year, creating a vacuum? So where is the legislature in the coming year? And how can we suddenly ask the Beijing to say, oh yes, you people can serve for 1 more year? I mean, this is ridiculous. And to hide behind the pandemic, but the professors, the doctors that the government use as advisors, they all say they have not been consulted. They have not consulted the medical professionals. And so it's a political decision, but they say it is a pandemic. So this is the situation we are facing in Hong Kong now. And I am very, very worried. And I think many of the Hong Kong people are very worried. And of course, they are pleased that the British government has finally offered to let the people who hold the British national overseas passports to go to Britain and to stay there for 5 years, and then they can apply for citizenship. But people want to stay here. They want China to keep the promise of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the basic law of 1 country, 2 systems. But now, I think it's all falling to pieces. And the president of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom recently issued a statement saying that he is very concerned about this national security law. I'm sure Professor Chen and you, Professor Reyes, you're aware of this statement. And he said he's waiting to see how the law is going to be implemented. And of course, we have judges from the Supreme Court of the UK sitting on our Court of Final Appeal. But whether they will continue to sit there, it depends on how the law is being implemented. And in my interview earlier today, Professor Chen said these judges are the canaries in the coal mine. If the canary dies, then everybody would know that there's no more 1 country, 2 system. And if these eminent judges are convinced that we have no 1 country, 2 systems, no high degree of autonomy, no rule of law, they are not going to come. And if the UK judges don't come, I'm sure the judges from other Commonwealth, common law jurisdictions like Australia and Canada, they are not going to come. So, Professor Chan, you tell us what's going to happen to Hong Kong's reputation of the rule of law and independent judiciary, which of course is the bedrock of our freedom and personal safety. I am very, very alarmed and very anxious.
Now, as you just said, a lot depends on how the law is implemented. So I don't believe that anyone from the National Security Office will come and knock on your door and arrest you. I mean, you look at the law, there are various stringent conditions set for when they can invoke their powers under the law. The conditions require specific approval by the Central People's Government, that is by the State Council, before the National Security Office in Hong Kong can take any action against any particular individual. And there are also conditions about what are the circumstances, what are the types of cases. And is it likely that this provision will never be used in the foreseeable future? So I agree with you that a lot depends on how the law is implemented.
Well, Professor
Emily,
Chen,
would you like to respond?
If what you say is true, why is it that so many people are so intimidated and are already conducting self-censorship, like the churches, like the journalists, like the teachers, like some academics, some politicians? They are not giving interviews. They are very frightened. Are you aware that this is happening in Hong Kong, Professor Chan?
I may not know as much as you do about what is happening in terms of self-censorship, but I don't believe that self-censorship is necessary or should be encouraged.
Emily, can I ask you one question before I go on to Bernard Chan? What about the concerns that the business community has had, that many other people have had, about the experience we had last year, where the economy really tanked, and then of course the pandemic made it even worse, that there were serious questions about the stability of Hong Kong and the peace and stability of our community. And that really is the motivation behind the introduction of this NSL. The fear that we might relive all of last year and the violence and all of the incidents that happened.
Well, I'm sure you're aware that the whole thing was sparked off by Carrie Lam's decision to introduce the extradition bill to solve the Taiwan murder case, but she also wanted the extradition to apply to mainland China and Macau and all the other places that we have no extradition treaties. And that got more than 1 million people onto the streets, very peaceful, marching. But then what did she do? What did Bernard Chen and the members of the Executive Council do? Never mind, the bill will go ahead. And that's what provoked the Hong Kong people. I never supported violence. I don't support all the violence that we've seen in the last year, but neither do I support the police brutality. So many people were beaten up, you know, all these bloody scenes that you've seen on TV. So, and we say, how do we solve the problem? There's so much hatred. We say, let's set up an independent commission of inquiry, something that Hong Kong has done on a number of other occasions. But what happened? Carrie Lam refused. So people have pointed a way out to solve the problem that you identify. But she refused to do it. So that's why, you know, the problem is not solved. People are very angry. More and more people have been arrested. Now we're talking about 10,000. And not a single police officer has been arrested. And you saw the way they beat people up so badly. So where is justice? If there is no justice, of course, the people will not be satisfied. I'm not saying the problem should not be resolved. It should be. And people have pointed a way out. But the administration of Carrie Lam, the Executive Council, Bernard Chen, they refuse to accept it.
Thank you. Now,
well, I just want to add that Emily said that that the government decided to go ahead with the bill despite the protest. But actually, the bill was suspended indefinitely just 6 days after the first big protest. So the first big protest occurred on a Sunday, and the bill was suspended indefinitely on the following Saturday. So it was only 6 days after the first big demonstration.
Thank you,
the
Albert.
people wanted the bill withdrawn, not just suspended, so it can come back again.
Thanks very much. I think it's time for us to bring Bernard Chen into the discussion. So Bernie, please, the floor is yours. Your thoughts. You've heard a lot already. What are your thoughts?
Well, yes. First of all, I would say thank you and good morning and good evening. And many thanks to U.S. Asia Institute for the terrific work you have been doing for 40 years. Now, exchanging ideas across our borders is always important, but it's especially so right now. So I'm honored that you invite me to be part of this discussion, a very lively discussion, you can tell. So let's talk about the National Security Law. Now, the National Security Law has now been in effect for almost 1 month, and Hong Kong is still here. Hong Kong has been through many enormous changes in its nearly 180 years of history. Now, we've been invaded, occupied. We have seen our economy transition from trading to manufacturing to finance. And since 1997, the year we returned to the Chinese sovereignty, we have now weathered 1 Asian financial crisis, 2 global financial crises, that's including now, and 2 pandemics. And at every one of these transformational points, Hong Kong has demonstrated amazing resilience. Now, we have also, time after time, been able to redefine ourselves successfully in the world-changing circumstances. Now, if you step back and look at the big picture, The national security law is just the latest in a long series of landmark turning points for Hong Kong. Now, right now, people are going through a whole range of reactions to our new post-new national security law landscape. I'll be the first to say that it is unfortunate that the law came about in the way it did. It was sudden and we were taken by surprise. But if you look back at the last several years in Hong Kong, from the Occupy Central in 2014 to the protests of 2019, and you can see the build-up and the rationale behind why the Chinese government decided it was urgent to push through this security legislation. The bottom line is that the national security law is now the law of Hong Kong. It is not going anywhere, whether we agree or disagree with the law and with the way it was promulgated. All of us in Hong Kong, Emily and Democrats, as well as the government supporters, need to accept it. We all need to see a positive side here as we move forward. Now, there is a new structure and a new set of guidelines in place, as Professor Chen put it. So how do we work with this structure to keep Hong Kong a successful, dynamic city with its own unique identity as we transform it yet again? Now, I mentioned the range of reactions to the new security law. Now, I like to focus at, you were asking me earlier, asking Emily about the business sector. I'm from the business sector, so let me tell you. So the business people, well, at least some of the business people I know are very happy about the law. Businesses, especially local companies that suffer due to the last year protests, are pleased that the uncertainty and the logistical upheaval are now not going to be repeated. Some are less happy. In the last few weeks, we have seen some tech companies move their server to other locations. The American Chamber of Commerce, so these are largely American companies based here, surveyed members and found 35.5% of them were thinking of moving some operations out of the city. But then 64.5% were not. So we are not seeing a rush for the doors yet. But why? Well, the business is taking its time and adopting a wait and see attitude. They also know that there are big potential opportunities not far ahead. For some time, Hong Kong has been shifting to become more of a China-focused business city. And at the same time, we have moved into a new era of US-China relations, one that is going to be more, adversarial. Some observers even suggest that the global economy is going to become more polarized, and there will be a separate US sphere and a Chinese one. So if that is where we are heading, then Hong Kong obviously has to be in the China sphere. We are part of the nation after all. Now, China has already committed to investing in Hong Kong's economy, both directly or through the Greater Bay Area Regional Plan that will tie together the economy of Hong Kong and with 8 other cities around the Pearl River Delta. They are changing regulations to allow new cross-regional business opportunities in investment products and so on. So Hong Kong is replacing New York as the launch site for the China IPOs, the initial public offerings. So will sanctions from the US and the other Western countries damage Hong Kong's economic potential? Well, I don't think that is going to be so easy. Both sides are too deeply invested in the other. We have 1,300 US companies in Hong Kong. US banks have 166 billion US dollars in total asset in the city. Hong Kong's top wealth management companies are mostly US based. So whatever the US does to hurt Hong Kong also threaten US companies too. So we are like the circle of gangsters in the John Woo movies, each with a pistol pointing at each other's head. Now, but I really don't think that anyone is going to pull the trigger. Well, I mean, let me just come back to some of the concerns that Emily raised just now. And as I said, we've been now 1 month after the law been passed. You know, we can still have this conversation, and we have this conversation tonight, right? So, you know, people still continue to complain about the government, complain about Carrie Lam. Things are just continue the way it is. Nothing has changed, provided that, you know, as Professor Chen put it, you don't do those 4 things. And I never seen, you know, Emily have any interest or any plan to separate Hong Kong from China. I know Emily has no interest to subvert the state power, nor that she's involved in any terrorist act or colluding with foreign forces to endanger national security. So long you don't do those 4 things, you have nothing to worry. But I can understand why everyone is now so, you know, agitated, because, you know, we're going through this period of time where everyone's is still trying to figure out where is the red line. Am I allowed or not allowed? I've been asked that question all the time. People ask me, whether can we still have, can you still do an interview with Joshua Wong? You know, can you still do that? I said, well, I suppose so. You know, so long that you are not providing him a platform. Again, providing him a platform, you have to further define, right? Are you on purpose try to give him a platform to promote separatism? Now, that I don't know. I mean, I'm not the prosecutor, nor I'm the court, so it will still be up to the, you know, whether the DOJ has ground to prosecute him, or at the court to agree to that. The court have to decide whether you have grounds too. But if you're not, if you're just providing a platform for news, for, you know, you have just an interview, why would that be a problem? But I can see why people are still trying to figure out what does that mean and what does that mean. So we're going through that period of time right now where, unfortunately, I think, I mean, I understand where the frustration coming from Emily, why some people are, you know, churches or whatever. I think a lot of people still try to figure out what is this law is all about. But again, I mean, as Professor Chen had put it very, you know, vividly, is so, you know, those are the 4 conditions where you will be caught, you know, as, you know, will be violating the law. But so the law is actually pretty straightforward. But I understand why people are now getting a bit very, you know, a little bit excited about, you know, the interpretation of that law. But anyway, I'm happy to answer questions.
But Bernie, can I just follow up, because you did mention the tech companies that have sort of decided they wouldn't share data, and I think, you know, the Hong Kong has been unique because it is probably the only place in the world where you have a sharing of data from the West and sharing of data from the mainland. Now, there are many other aspects of Hong Kong that are special. I mean, the United States has withdrawn a recognition of special trading status. And what are the consequences of that? And we've also seen recently, the New York Times announced that it would move some of its staff to Seoul because of their concerns about the national security law. I'm wondering if you could deal with those questions, because there are indications that people are not necessarily going to wait for the ambiguity to get more focused, if you will.
No, as I said, I spoke to some international news agencies in Hong Kong. I can see their concern, and it takes time. I mean, actually, well, one of the major news agency asked me, because I said, well, I asked her too. I said, listen, you know, you have your bureaus in Beijing, so why would that be an issue for you? I mean, for Hong Kong, well, I guess apparently, according to her, in Beijing, the lines are very clear, so they know exactly what they can do and what not to do. So suppose, and they still need time to figure out what is this new law not going to do to Hong Kong. So they're trying to figure it out. So, you know, for the server, for these tech company, I'm sure they will return. They will return. But I think for this time, this period of time, probably it would take time. They probably want to not put all the eggs in one basket. They want to wait and see approach. But look at the other companies. So it really depends on what nature of business you're in. You talk to most of the other businesses I talk to, actually the law to them has no problem, right? Because why would they have a problem with a national security law? So they actually feel that even they feel safe to be in Hong Kong. But I understand from certain businesses, maybe there's a bit of a uncertainty, especially from their head office. The people that are already in Hong Kong, they probably don't feel the issue, but their head office, especially with all the media, the Western media, making almost as like this is the end of Hong Kong, right? All the negative news you hear from the overseas, so I won't be surprised that their head offices are of bigger concern than those actually are based here physically.
But is this chilling effect that we've seen that will last probably a while before we see clarity? Is this even desirable at this time when we're being confronted by the pandemic, the economy is really reeling? It does not seem to help, really.
Well, I don't think there's a choice. As I mentioned in my earlier statements, I mean, there was a clear national threat to the central government, given what happened in the last few years, and in particular last year when there's a complete breakdown of law and order in Hong Kong. So I think it gives really Beijing no choice. I mean, as Professor Chen had put it, this whole national security law has been overdue in Hong Kong for 23 years. It was actually our constitutional obligation to pass the national security law, but we never did. And of course, all this time we can argue that there's no real national security threat here. But given what the happened last few years, and particularly last 1 year, and with, in fact, even with some of the terrorist activities in town, I don't think we have any more excuses to delay any further. So I think, I agree with you that it could have done differently. It could have done better if we passed this law locally through our legislature. But we never, for 23 years, we never did. So I think, it really not really much of a choice anymore.
Thank you. Now, I realize that we're taking longer than I anticipated, so I'm going to try to go to questions from the audience, from our listeners and viewers. But I thought Emily, if I might allow you and Albert to respond to what Bernie has said. Emily,
well,
please.
if I may just say something.
Yes.
We talk a bit about how the law is being applied, and we will see. But actually, when we were having the discussion, the police have gone in to arrest 3 young people from the group called Student Localism. And one of them is Chung Hon Lam, and charging them with secession. And actually, earlier, this young man, Mr. Chung, has already announced that he will step down from being the convener of the group, Student Localism, and he will actually leave the group. So I thought this law has no retrospective effect. But now they are arresting young people, 3 of them so far, and it's the police who are doing it, not yet the national security. So that's why tomorrow it will be all over the newspapers, all over social media. They are acting, they are arresting people using this law. So I can understand why more people will practice self-censorship and more families will want to leave Hong Kong.
Albert?
Well, I think the news which Emily just told us is really news. It only happened while we are discussing, so we don't really know sufficient facts in order to discuss this piece of news.
Well,
all right.
But it's a fact that the police arrested them, but of course we can find out more later. But they are applying the law already. Many people are watching here and overseas to see how they apply the law. So they are applying it for us to see.
So let's see how they apply the law. You said that the Legislative Council election should not be postponed, even if the reason is the pandemic. But actually, postponing the election does not work in the advantage of the government, because people can then wait to see how the law is being enforced, how the national security law is being enforced. If it is enforced in a way which is draconian and unacceptable, I'm sure 1 year from now, the pan-democrats will even get more votes than what they would get now.
Now, can I go to some questions? We have a question from asking if the panelists can address the part of the national security law that concerns extraterritorial reach of the law for anyone, anywhere, making comments about the Chinese government. Albert, can you address that?
Yes. Actually, the extraterritorial reach of this law is based on provisions similar to those in China's criminal law. China's criminal law also has extraterritorial reach, as is the law of many other states, including the US. In fact, the US is also quite well known for the extraterritorial effect of many of its laws. But I would like to point out that this extraterritorial reach is quite limited to subversive acts against Hong Kong rather than the PRC government. If you read the relevant article, according to the concerning the extraterritorial effect, it expressly says that as far as subversion is concerned, these non-Hong Kong permanent residents outside Hong Kong will only be guilty of any offense against this law if the subversion is against the Hong Kong SCL government. So if the subversion is against the PRC government, it seems that this particular provision will not apply. So it seems that it is directed mainly to protect the Hong Kong government as far as the extraterritorial reach is concerned.
This is Article 38. Emily, I assume you have a different view on this, because it is worrying a lot of people, I think.
Well, of course. Actually, whether it's this article or other article, I think what many people fear is that the authorities would criminalize free speech. So you may say something, you may express a view, and you never know that you would have stepped on the red line. So that's why people say, would they dare to interview Chris Patton again, or Joshua Wong, or whatever? So that's the fear. And now you extend it to people all over the world. So that's why some governments are telling their citizens, be careful. Don't say it. You go to Hong Kong, or, if you say something, you might have overstepped the mark. So it is creating a lot of fear because of so much uncertainty and the wide reach of this law.
Indeed, Bernie, if I could go to you, some people have already suggested that if they're transiting in Hong Kong airport and they might have said something that disagrees with the Chinese government, that they could be arrested in transit. Is that some concern that you've heard?
Well, Al, I just said in my opening remarks that
yes,
we are now 1 month after the law has been passed.
Yes.
I open the newspaper, I see people complaining, criticizing Hong Kong government, Chinese government every single day. That is part of our Hong Kong DNA. Criticizing the government is not breaching the law. I mean, you can continue to criticize. You can criticize Carrie Lam, probably Xi Jinping, no problem. The law specifically said that you have to do those 4 things, and not only that. You do it. It's not doing. You have, and we'll tell you more detail. You have to have a specific plan to subvert the state power. Just because you are not happy with the government, doesn't breach the law. So if you read the law carefully, it doesn't. Your freedom of expression is still being upheld in Hong Kong. So I understand Emily, because she's been worried all these years. So I mean, I can't change her mind. So my recommendation is for the U.S. Asia Institute to hold this seminar again a year from now. And let's see how many people actually get caught under this law. But frankly, I tell all my friends overseas, you continue to criticize. I have people criticizing, the Communist Party all the time. So long you're not overthrowing the party, but it's not even overthrowing. You actually have an action. You gotta have a plan, right? Just by saying it, it's not going to get you in trouble. But anyway, I'll let Professor Chen to explain.
Albert,
more
you were going to say something, yes?
I think people should read the law and its provision, and not just listen to what others say that this and that may be unlawful under the law. I mean, I've tried to explain this provision on subversion, which some people are worried about, and I want to stress again and again that this subversion under Article 22 requires as an essential element the use of force or the threat of force or other unlawful means. And if you commit an act of force or threat of force or use any unlawful means for the following purposes, then you might be caught. One purpose is to overthrow the basic system of the PRC. The other is to overthrow the Hong Kong government, or to try to attack the premises of an organ of power. I think this provision is directed against what happened on July the 1st last year, in which some people broke into the Legislative Council and damaged all of its facilities. So you read the provision, and I think the most important thing to note about it is that it doesn't criminalize speech as such, unless the speech involves advocating the use of force or unlawful means to overthrow the government. So even if you want to, you advocate overthrowing the government, so long as you don't advocate doing it by unlawful means, which means something which is already unlawful under Hong Kong's criminal law, then it would not be a problem. So people can still advocate peaceful political change in China. So long as no unlawful means is advocated.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'm wondering if I could go to another question from our viewers. It's about US support for Hong Kong. And I know there are many congressional staffers who are in the audience at the moment. Is supporting Hong Kong in the US's long-term interest? If it is, then in what ways can the US be most supportive of Hong Kong's political autonomy and safety? And if not, then what steps do you think the US will take to preserve its interests in the region? Emily, I know that you're I think you manage international outreach for the Democratic Party, if I'm not mistaken. I'm wondering if you could address this, this question. And then we'll go to Bernie after. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it is not just applying it to the U.S., but to the international community. And because last year, the Democratic Party appointed me to chair the International Affairs Committee, and we have many young members who sit on the Central Committee of the party. And what we do is we reach out to the diplomatic community, or even to foreign journalists, academics, business people. And of course, we ask them to support Hong Kong, to support our call for, preservation of freedoms, rule of law, and to develop democracy. And so, whether it is the U.S. government or any other government who believe in democracy and human rights, we certainly hope that they will speak out. And I know that, of course, they just don't speak out for the sake of us. Actually, many countries have a lot of interest here. And some, Canada, they say they have 300,000 of their citizens living here. And the U.S., maybe they have 80,000, and the British and the French, the Japanese, and so on. So they have a lot of their own interests here. So we certainly hope that they will not just be concerned about making money. And of course, we think people should engage the Chinese government. But we also hope that the Chinese government would, follow the international civilized code of behavior. That is respect for human rights, rule of law, democracy, and so on. And also there is a thing called reciprocity, you know, which Professor Larry Diamond of Stanford University talked about a lot. And he, of course, is the teacher of Mrs. Regina Yip. And Professor Diamond talked about reciprocity. That is, if people, if Chinese people go to America or to UK or Australia, and they get access to many things. They can do research, they can do interviews, all sorts of things. But then if their people go to China, they don't get reciprocal treatment. They do not get access to many things which are, which the Chinese people go to their country have access to. And that, of course, is not fair. So I certainly hope, and Bernie, of course, he's a member of the National People's Congress, he can tell us why that China would not give reciprocal treatment to all these people who come to China to trade, to study, to work as journalists. So I hope our friends who go to China would make these demands and would not just say, oh, I want to make money, so if I don't get reciprocal treatment on other things, I turn a blind eye. I don't want them to do that. I want China to be open and to respect human rights and to trade with everybody on equal basis. And that's what I hope our friends in America, in elsewhere, that's a message I give to them.
Bernie, I'm wondering if you could address this issue with the United States. In fact, you might also address news reports recently that you have had your own issues with a bank account. Now, I know there might be some inaccurate reporting there, so that it's been in the news. Perhaps you can also mention that.
Well, to start with, I think, like Emily put it, there's such a close interest between the U.S. and Hong Kong. I mean, I went to school, I went to high school and college in the U.S. I have many friends in the U.S. and there are many of Hong Kong people like myself has such a strong tie with the U.S. So it would be very sad for us to see this continuous tension between U.S. and China, and Hong Kong being in the middle. We are sort of the collateral damage in this whole big trade war between the two countries. Now, just to sidetrack a bit about my own personal experience, the news being reported in Hong Kong today, actually it was today, it's reported today that my saving account, I have a saving account in the U.S. bank in the U.S., onshore U.S., was being closed. Now the account was closed not because of the whole national security law or the Hong Kong Act. It's nothing to do with it. It's actually more to do with me being a PEPs. PEPs is political exposed person. Emily is one too. So if Emily ever going to open a bank account in U.S., she's going to have the same problem because we are politicians. So these days, under the very stringent banking regulations, banks have to do more work, do more compliance work when deal with clients with a political background. So that's what it is. So I guess when I went to open the account, they never bothered to check my background. But I guess a year later, through I'm sure that every banks have a software to run through, update the PEP. So as soon as that system runs through it, my name pops up. So they send me a nice letter and saying, thank you very much. We're closing this account for you. And they send me back to my money. So anyway, that's just a side thing. But coming back to this US thing, actually, I was invited by the US Consul General in Hong Kong back in March. In fact, by the way, that was the last trip I made to the US because, then we are now in COVID lockdown, right? So the Consul General invited 5 or 6 of us. We have the 2 Pan Democrats from Let's Go in Legislative Council going along this trip together with 3 of us from the Executive Council. The other 2 are also members of the, actually 3 of them. There's 3 members from the legislature who are more pro-establishment, and also 2 members from the so-called the opposition camp, the Pan Democrats. So the 6 of us, we were invited and to a retreat, and we have a chance to talk to our U.S. counterparts, so the consul generals and some of the staffers from Washington D.C. They came, and I thought it was a very good occasion. So we have a good, genuine dialogue, and I think these sort of dialogues should be promoted. I hate to see now all the things you hear these days is about sanction. I sanction you, you sanction me, and retaliation. That's not really helpful, in building partnership, because we need partnership. But I can understand now, we have elections coming, so so you never know. But I'm hoping, I'm actually still hopeful that we will return to common sense, because U.S. and China need each other, and Hong Kong is in the middle. So it's of no interest for all parties concerned to get carried away into this whole sanction through the with all the unnecessary political posturing.
Albert, if I might turn to you, particularly one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the ability of Hong Kong universities to collaborate with US universities as Hong Kong gets caught in the middle. Already we've seen the Fulbright program with China, the United and with Hong Kong, I guess canceled. What are your concerns in this regard? I mean, this could particularly be important in STEM research, say, in sensitive areas, the ability, the collaboration between Hong Kong universities and US universities in science and technology research.
Well, I think there's nothing in the national security law that that discourages or limits such cooperation. Actually, originally, when the NPC passed its decision in May, the concept or the term used for this 4th subject matter to be dealt with by the law was foreign interference in Hong Kong affairs. But when the law was drafted, this was narrowed down to become collusion with foreign forces to endanger national security. So given this narrowing down of the scope of this law as far as foreign interference is concerned, I think the provision as it now stands actually will not in any way hurt Hong Kong's international cooperation with other...
I guess I'm more concerned about the fact that the US action is what is in some ways potentially endangering this kind of cooperation.
Yes, exactly. So the problem is not with the law, the problem is the US reaction to the law. So it is regrettable that the US has imposed this sanction on Hong Kong called normalization, which means we're withdrawing Hong Kong's special status, treating Hong Kong as if it is part of mainland China. So that is the sanction, and there may be other sanctions. So it's not the law which tries to limit our international contact and collaboration. It's the actions of foreign governments, like some governments suspending all these extradition arrangements or other criminal assistance in criminal investigation and so on. I don't think this is in the interest of either party concerned.
Emily, can I turn to you, because you mentioned the BNO issue. There are 2 sides to that. Offering pathway for BNO passport holders to seek residency and then citizenship in the UK could potentially lead to some kind of a brain drain from Hong Kong.
Well, of course it could, and some people actually, they may not want to go to the UK's, and the UK government has asked the other 5 I countries to have a more lenient immigration policy, so Hong Kong people can go there as well. So of course it's bad, but I think that what I would like to do is to give Hong Kong people an alternative, an option. if they are so frightened, if they are so angry, and if they want to leave, that they can. I don't want to see them trapped here. And going back to the point about the bank accounts, Bernie talked about his own case, but you must have heard, you saw the story last week in the newspapers, that it is in relation to the national security law. The Hong Kong Bank and a few other banks, I think Credit Suisse and others, they are actually checking their own clients to see what connections they have with political parties or with government officials. And why are they doing it? Because I think they are very scared. These are not American banks. Maybe American banks do what Bernie just said, but these are British banks and other foreign banks. And they say they do it because they are not too clear about the law. So it is very, very worrying. And the point about you put to Albert about cooperation with foreign universities. Well, you heard about the Benny Tai case, Associate Professor Benny Tai, and who was fired by the Hong Kong U yesterday. And it made headlines all over the world. What has he done? He just tried to stir up peaceful protests, Occupy Central, to fight for democracy. And what happened? He's got tenure at the university. And even the Senate of the university said he should not be sacked, but the council just reversed it. And Benny's case is on appeal. The appeal has not been heard. So do you think academics from other universities will look at Hong Kong U and others and say, oh, wow, you still have freedom of research, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression. It's a place we love to come and work. Do you seriously think so?
But I suppose, Emily, you know very well that Benny, who is my colleague, was dismissed by our university not because of his academic research or his academic writings. It is because he was convicted by a Hong Kong court of an offense and sentenced to a particular period of imprisonment. This is not the first case. There were other cases in our university in which a teacher or professor who had a criminal conviction was dismissed. So I think that is. I don't believe that in this particular case is a question of academic freedom.
Now, if I could go to another question, if the national security law is so limited and clearly defined, as Professor Chen asserts, on what legal basis is the Hong Kong police force arresting people, holding up signs saying, "Liberate Hong Kong, revolution in our time," for alleged secession under the NSL and some PR? And some officials, Chinese and Hong Kong officials, are claiming that legislative council members voting against the government's budget is an act of sedition under the NSL. Is voting for or against the government's budget now, isn't that one of the powers of the Legislative Council? Bernie, I'm wondering if you could just address that issue.
Okay, holding the sign. Now, of course, by the way, the entire national security law is still enforceable, needs to be enforceable in Hong Kong. So you have the police, enforcing the law, but then in order to justify to prosecute, the DOJ has to find grounds. So and then of course, and it's still up to the Hong Kong independent court to determine whether, there is a case. So all the check and balances are there. So even if the person is being arrested, I mean, it doesn't mean that, he will be eventually being criminalized. He has to go through all our due processes. So even if the police are assuming that, hey, you hold that sign of promoting separatism, because that sign could easily be interpreted as an independence of Hong Kong. But even if the police, they have suspicions or they have grounds to believe that there is a motive behind, well, you still have to go through another level to making, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, have to find evidence in order to prosecute. Otherwise, the case will never be held in court. So I think there is enough a due process in there to making sure that, that by the way, it's still under the common law jurisdiction as well. So, until it's proven that the person alleged is still, is still innocent. But I'll let Professor Chen, I mean, he will probably put in better phrases for me.
I think we have to take into account the express provisions in this national security law on the protection of human rights. Article 4 says that all these human rights, including the rights guaranteed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which are at the moment enshrined in Hong Kong's Bill of Rights Ordinance. All these rights are supposed to be protected, even when this law is applied. Now, who is going to apply the law? In the first instance, it will be the Hong Kong courts. So when Hong Kong courts interpret and apply this law, they will have to give due weight to Article 4 concerning the continued applicability of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, it's true that the National People's Congress Standing Committee has the final power of interpretation, but they are unlikely to exercise this power of interpretation easily or in many cases. So 99% of the cases will be dealt with by the Hong Kong courts interpreting the law on their own. Just like the NPCSC, they have the power to interpret the basic law, but from 1997 up to now, 23 years, they have only interpreted the basic law 5 times. And 99% of Hong Kong laws are being interpreted by Hong Kong courts.
Thank you. Now, I'm mindful that we're nearing the end of the session. I wanted to give each of you a chance to give some last a couple of minutes each of your closing thoughts. I guess where I suggest you might focus is we're in the run-up to the Legislative Council elections currently scheduled for September 6th, but there's talk of some kind of postponement. What is your sort of outlook for the run-up to that important sort of event? And I guess the overarching question that we've been trying to deal with tonight, and maybe we've been too granular, is what do you see then as the future of autonomy, of Hong Kong's autonomy? Where are we heading? Is it still too early to be seen, to be discerned? We have to see the implementation of the NSL to get a clear picture. And I'm wondering if I could start with you, Emily.
Well, I think many people will say that we haven't got much autonomy left. And that's why the president of the UK Supreme Court is really wondering whether their judges should continue to come to Hong Kong, because if we have no one country, two systems, no high degree of autonomy, then they are not going to come and be used and to show that we have, when in fact it's something that we haven't got. So I think there is a lot of concern amongst not just the political parties, but amongst academics, professional people, even business people, that we feel that the autonomy is really withering away. And then if in the next day or two, if the administration comes out to announce they will postpone the election, and they say they do it on health and medical grounds, but the medical experts said that they have not been consulted. And then we see election held in Singapore, in South Korea recently, and there were no big outbreak of the pandemic. So I think it would be very sad to see them. And then they say they need to go to Beijing to help them to bolster the decision. So if you are sitting in Beijing, you would say these people are so useless. You know, the people are frightened. They're frightened they will lose the election. So they ask Beijing to help them to postpone the election for 1 year and just turn Hong Kong and Beijing into a laughingstock in the international community. So I think people are really very worried, very concerned, very anxious. In fact, we want the Hong Kong to work, go back to the old Hong Kong when we are safe, we are free, we are vibrant, and then we can, do all the economic things to make a successful city, but also to fight for democracy. That's what we are after. But now, the course has been changed, and people are very anxious. They all talk about immigration, where to go, and to keep themselves out of prison. So this is really, so if you talk about autonomy, people will say, are you kidding me? Is there any autonomy left? So it is a very, very sorry state of affairs.
Thank you. Albert?
Well, if you look at Hong Kong in 2017, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the HKSAR, and President Xi Jinping came to Hong Kong and gave a speech, and at that time it looked as if everything was fine. And Mrs. Carrie Lam became chief executive, replacing Mr. C.Y. Leung. Also in 2017, and then she said that her plan during her 5 years of as chief executive would be mainly to focus on the economy and people's livelihood. So nobody could have predicted that Hong Kong would end up in the situation which we are now in. So what happened? I think it's a matter of contingency. There's this Chen Tong Tai case, this 19-year-old man in Hong Kong committed a murder in Taiwan, and Taiwan asked for his extradition. And if there were no such case, I don't think that the government would have put forward this extradition bill. Mr. Bernard Chen knows better than me since he's in the Executive Council. So I think the original purpose of the extradition bill is not oppressive. It is also to plug a loophole in Hong Kong's existing law regarding possible extradition as between Hong Kong and other parts of China. Now, Taiwan, mainland, and also Macau are all other parts of China for the purpose of Hong Kong law. But people misunderstood the purpose of this law. They thought that the purpose of the law was to extradite people who are anti-government to mainland for trial. That is a complete misunderstanding of the purpose of this law. So all these protests, but as I said, the government already suspended the bill indefinitely, 6 days after the first big protest. And yet people were not satisfied, they continued to protest. So there were more violent clashes between the police and protesters. So this continued. On the 1st of July, the Legislative Council was broken into and extensively damaged. On the 1st of October, the Chinese National Day, the riots reached a bigger scale than ever before. So that is the situation. People, believe that Hong Kong is getting out of control. Businessmen were worried, as Bernard just said. And that's why we have the national security law. Now with the national security law, foreign governments reacted strongly and imposed sanctions on Hong Kong, withdrew cooperation with Hong Kong and so on. So I think this is a vicious circle. It only makes things worse. And if the local election is postponed on the pandemic ground, and other countries, consider it, a postponement for political purposes, that would also be a misunderstanding, because I don't see how after 1 year the pro-government political parties would definitely do better than what they can do now. Because after 1 year, we can see how the national security law is being enforced. If it's enforced in a way which people consider to be unacceptable, I'm sure the opposition politician would get more votes than what they would get if the election is held this September. So
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Albert. Now, I'm reliably told that we could go, we're already a little bit over time, but I'm reliably told that we could go a little bit longer. So Bernie, before you address the issue of autonomy, the future of autonomy, your closing thoughts, I'm wondering if you could address the question about the pandemic and Hong Kong's handling of it. And a lot of people are particularly nervous about it starting today because of the new restrictions that we've experienced. And then if you could address the broader question of Hong Kong's autonomy.
Well, the fact is, I don't see this virus time soon. Now, we have been successfully suppress the spread of virus in the earlier months. And as soon as we start to open, the numbers come back. Now, early on when your introduction, you talk about, we have now in over the 1 week of, cases over 100 each day. So this is, I think, it's going to keep repeating. So the methodology that used in Hong Kong is something called the suppress and lift. So we're never going to go into a full lockdown because I don't think a full lockdown makes sense for Hong Kong. But yet, each time when we open up, when the confirmed cases rise, we have to shut it. And of course, we have to shut it by phases. Now, today, as you put it, we're down to only, all the restaurants are not open for dining in. So these are pretty harsh. So if these numbers start to come down, we might open up, right? But as soon as we open up, depending on how we can handle the cases again, we might have to shut down again. So this back and forth will stay for a while. I'm afraid that it will stay probably until we find a virus. Find a vaccine. And it will be months, I hope, if not just years away. So
now, folks have been critical of the government, though, because they say, well, there were a lot of loopholes and the quarantine procedures were not
well, this is the
coherent.
problem. This is the problem, right? Are you prepared to open up? I mean, the reason why we have the exemption is to allow the air crew to come through into the seamen that come through. If you want a bulletproof, then I don't think, economically, this Hong Kong will survive on its own. And interestingly, you look at Asia, in most Asian countries, we adopt almost zero tolerance. Meantime, you go to US, hey, they have no quarantine, no testing required. Anyone can enter the US freely. I don't know how the whole world will actually converse now, because most of the Western countries adopt pretty much a herd immunity methodology, while in this part of the world in Asia, we have like zero tolerance. Zero tolerance is fine, but are you ever going to open up? As soon as you open, then you risk, that there will be cases that come. So sure, we don't give exemption, but if you don't give exemption, we have to pay in other means. Definitely economically, we have to pay. In fact, if we don't allow these seamen and the air crew to come through, now, of course, we have tightened that since, right? We're no longer allow them to come in without pre-testing. So now all of them needs to be pre-test before allowing them to come in. But by not letting in or not letting anyone in, I don't think it will, our business, our economy can sustain. I'm not so sure how we're going to sustain, in fact, even as it is today, because I think, the retail sector is going to be hurt pretty badly going forward. But let me go back to the other question you asked.
Yes, the autonomy question.
Now, I think, looking at the history, some of them is before my time, but I was told, Hong Kong has gone through crisis one after the other in the 60s, in the 70s, in the early 80s, the late 80s, and then in the 90s. Each time, each of these crises, we have people leaving Hong Kong. But the good news is we're to Hong Kong. So I think, this current crisis we are facing, we're going to see that's just going to see this repeat again. There will be brain drain. But the important thing is Hong Kong still relevant? If Hong Kong still relevant, we will still have people, and this is so important. So I will US and other countries.
Bernie, could you just repeat that, because your audio wasn't so good? Could you just repeat the last thought you had there? Sorry, the audio wasn't so good. Could you just repeat what you were saying?
No, I was asked, in fact, I worry. Yeah, I said, I've been asked multiple times whether I worry that US and other countries, Western countries, not trusting Hong Kong, right? Not wanting to do things with Hong Kong. And my answer to that is, of course I'm worried. I would not want to. But I'm even more worried if China lost trust in Hong Kong. If China lost trust in China, and we need China, we are economically and socially integrated with China today. Politically, we're not, because we have the two systems. So politically, we're still separate. But economically and socially, we are integrating fast. So it is so important that over the last 1 year, even with all the unrest, the social unrest we have, China repeatedly confirmed the one country, two system. So that is so important. They still believe in two systems, because they could have easily, Professor Chen can comment on that if we still have time. They could, if they could easily have introduced a Chinese mainland national security law to Hong Kong. They could have done that, but they didn't, because they want to have the two systems. So they specifically draft a new law, a hybrid new law for Hong Kong. So even this is a national law, but this is a Hong Kong, particularly applicable to Hong Kong. So they didn't want to just to introduce the Chinese law to Hong Kong. They introduced a specific new law just for Hong Kong in order to preserve the two systems. So I actually still very hopeful that the two systems can maintain and can continue. But then it's up to Hong Kong people. And the system is there, the structure is there, but it's still up to Hong Kong people how we want to take advantage of the two systems. We have to work with China. Unfortunately, not everyone in Hong Kong see it that way. There are people in Hong Kong that want the less of China. But unfortunately, I don't think that will actually help Hong Kong to move beyond 2047. China honored the two systems to 2047, but nothing said about after 2047, right? So to me, the only way to ensure Hong Kong two system can move beyond 2047 is for Hong Kong to continue to play a role for China, right? So we have to engage China. We need to understand the needs of China to serve their purpose. But if parts of Hong Kong people think that I want less of China, unfortunately, I don't think that will actually move the two systems beyond 2047.
Thank you. Emily, I understand you wanted to just say something to add to your earlier words.
Well, I just want to tell the international community that Hong Kong people, many of us are very, very alarmed and very concerned about the possible application of the national security law, and that's in particular, but more generally is how Beijing is closing in on us, and also the administration here seem to be looking to Beijing all the time to receive orders or to tell her what to do. So it seems that we are losing our autonomy, and with that, of course, we're losing our freedom, our personal safety, the rule of law, and maybe the independence of the judiciary. And so that's why the British government and other governments have said that this is in breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and also the Basic Law. And what we have been told that, how we can keep horse racing, we can continue dancing, we can continue to have our freedoms and develop a democracy. But that doesn't seem to be anymore. And that's why you talk about the BNO, and we talk about immigration to Australia, to New Zealand, to America, to Canada. And that is terrible. We don't want that. But something has to be done to give the people the reassurance that, that Beijing is not going to break its promise and not going to undermine the high degree of autonomy. And people should have the right to elect our government. As someone said to me today, hey, they've got the national security law now. Next thing is Article 45 of the Basic Law about a universal suffrage. So, of course, nobody's talking about it. I don't think Bernie is talking about it. So nothing is happening to give people reassurance, to tell them that, hey, you stay here, everything will be okay, you will have your freedom and your personal safety. But that's not to be. That's why people are so anxious, so frightened.
Thank you very much. Bernie, can you give a final word? Where is that reassurance? How do we reassure people?
only time can give you the reassurance. And I'm sure, as I mentioned earlier, you can host this event again a year from now, and I'm sure everyone will still be fine. Emily still will be very fine. She will continue to be holding the governments to the check. So I think that the due process, the check and balance remains in Hong Kong, but there must be a red line to be drawn so people know that they cannot make any attempt for secession, subverting the state power, or colluding with foreign forces to create national security, endanger national security in Hong Kong. Those are the red line. But other than that, I mean, Hong Kong will remain Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Let me just quickly try to summarize. It's going to be very difficult, but look, I think we all agree that the next months, the next year will be very important in seeing how the implementation of the national security law will go. And that will be quite telling. And I guess in some ways, the real litmus test for the quality of the autonomy of Hong Kong. If I can go back to link this with the pandemic, at the end of the day, the way we succeeded with the pandemic in the early stages, when the first wave and even the second wave, and I'm quite sure in the third wave, is it was left to Hong Kong people themselves who took the initiative. Some people might recall that in the early days, the government was a little bit ambiguous about whether we should wear masks. But of course, the Hong Kong people acted quickly, most people wearing masks, most people observing social distancing. So at the end of the day, when it comes to strengthening Hong Kong's autonomy, strengthening its democracy, even in the current conditions, the uncertainty that we face, I think the important message is that in many ways, it really must be up to the Hong Kong people to continue to express their views, to continue to do what they can to ensure that they can continue to exercise the freedoms and watch, and do what they can to ensure that we can preserve Hong Kong's way of life, the way of life of Hong Kong people, Hong Kong values, the rule of law, and Hong Kong's future, indeed, as part of China, because that is, in some ways, the bottom line, that Hong Kong is part of China, and that indeed is an immutable fact. So thank you very much, Emily Lau. Thank you very much, Albert Chen. Thank you very much, Bernard Chan. Thank you very much to our viewers. Thank you very much to the US Asia Institute for giving us this time. And maybe a year from now, we can come back and discuss exactly, with some facts, concrete evidence about how the NSL has been implemented. So thank you, and have a good day to all our viewers in the United States, and a very good evening to our viewers in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Before we close, I want to say thank you very much to our speakers, Professor Chen, Mr. Chan, and Madam Lau, and Mr. Alejandro Reyes. Thank you very much for this great discussion. To our audience, if you would like to receive the audio, we're going to have the audio and video available on our website at usasiainstitute.org, and you can send us an email if you have any other questions. Thank you very much. Have a good night if you're calling from Hong Kong. Thank you very much, and bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.